Barbara stood at the altar in a white dress that felt like a funeral shroud. The church was packed, not with well-wishers but with vultures. Every rival, every business associate, every person her father had ever competed with sat in those pews, waiting to see if this marriage would save the family empire or bury it. She didn't know which outcome terrified her more. "You can still run," her mother whispered, adjusting Barbara's veil with trembling hands. "Your father won't." Barbara's throat tightened. Alive? What a cruel word for what she did become. A chess piece, a contract, a bargaining chip in a war that had consumed her entire childhood. The organ began to play. "Too late," Barbara whispered back. She walked down the aisle again and alone. Her father refused to give her away, a silent protest against his own decision. The man waiting at the altar was Moses, tall, dark-eyed, with a jaw carved from stone and an expression that was colder than winter. He didn't smile, he didn't soften. When she reached him, he simply stared at her as if she were an obligation to be endured, not a woman to be cherished. "This is my life now," Barbara thought. Taking his hand, it was warm, but the grip was firm, businesslike. A woman married to a man who hates everything I represent. What she didn't know was that Moses was thinking something entirely different. "She's terrified," he observed, watching her white knuckles grip the backwards. "Good, fear keeps people sharp." But as the priest began the ceremony, Moses noticed something unexpected. Despite the fear in her eyes, Barbara held her head high. She didn't flinch, and when the priest declared them husband and wife, when he slipped the ring on her finger, she looked directly at him, not with submission, but with quiet defiance. For the first time in 20 years, Moses felt something crack inside his armor. He had married her to win a war. He had no idea she would teach him what it meant to lose his hatred instead. Please watch, subscribe, like and share. Thank you and God bless you. The penthouse was beautiful in the way a museum is beautiful. Pristine, cold and utterly devoid of life. Barbara stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, her white dress still clinging to her skin like a second skeleton. Below, the city glittered in the darkness, indifferent to her existence. She had been Miss Moses for exactly 4 hours. She could hear him moving through the apartment behind her, removing his jacket and loosening his tie. The sound of a man undressing in his own house. The sound of ownership. A knock on the bathroom door, a pause, then the sound of water running. Barbara didn't turn around. She couldn't bear to see him, to acknowledge what was coming. She had overheard her mother's fragmented warnings, seen the knowing looks from the church guests. This was what marriage meant. This was the price of the alliance. Her hands trembled against the cold glass. The water stopped. Footsteps. He emerged from the bedroom in dark silk pajamas, his chest still glistening with moist from the shower. He was undeniably handsome, the kind of handsome that made her father's hatred seem almost pathetic. How could two men hate each other so completely when no one of them looked like that? Moses saw her at the window solitude, against the city light. For a moment he simply watched her, the rigid spine, the clenched fists, the barely concealed terror radiating from her like heat. He had expected docile, resignated, tears, certainly. He had not expected this strange, defiant fragility. Without a word, he turned and walked to the guest bedroom across the hall. He closed the door quietly. Barbara heard it click shut, then silence. She didn't move for a long time. She stood at the window until her reflection became clearer than the city beyond it. A beautiful woman in a white dress, alone in a cage of glass and steel, staring at herself like a stranger. When she finally turned away from the window, she found herself in the master's bedroom, his bedroom. The bed was enormous, draped in black silk. A single pillow on her side remained untouched. She understood. Then, what had just happened? What he had chosen not to do. It didn't comfort her, it confused her. Barbara sat at the edge of the bed, still in her wedding dress, and waited for sleep that wouldn't come. Outside, the city continued its indifferent glistering. Inside, a woman tried to understand why the man was supposed to fear had just left her alone. The apartment was empty when she woke up the next morning. Barbara had fallen asleep in her dress somewhere between midnight and dawn, twisted in the black silk sheet, like a ghost caught between words. There was a note on the pillow next to her, written in precise angular handwriting. Breakfast is in the kitchen. The housekeeper arrives at 9. Your things have been moved to the master bedroom closet. No signature, no warmth, just logistics. She found the guest's bedroom empty. The bathroom showed no evidence he had used it that morning. He had simply vanished before dawn, leaving her alone in the penthouse like a wife abandoned on her wedding night, which technically she was. Barbara moved through the apartment like a ghost, touching nothing, afraid of breaking something that didn't belong to her. The kitchen was pristine, modern, expensive, and cold at the same time. On the marble counter sat a tray with fresh fruits, pastries, and coffee still steaming. Someone had been thinking of her. She ate mechanically, tasting nothing. The closet in the master bedroom was a shock. Her wedding dress hung alone among his tailored suits and expensive shirts. The contrast was obscene. Her white silk among his blacks and greys, like a flower dropped into a graveyard. Barbara stood in front of the mirror and studied her reflection. The woman staring back looked haunted. Her hair was still pinned from the ceremony, slightly askew. Her makeup had smoked beneath her eyes. She looked like a girl playing dress up in her mother's wedding gown. She looked like a woman who had been played. By noon, she had unpacked her single suitcase. By afternoon, she had explored every room in the penthouse and found them all equally impersonal. No photographs, no evidence of a life lived, just surfaces. Expensive, perfect, empty. He didn't come home that night or the next. By the fourth day, Barbara had stopped waiting by the window. She had stopped expecting the elevator to announce his arrival. She had stopped hoping that he might see her as something more than a contract to be managed. Instead, she had begun to memorize the layout of her cage. And in the strange quiet of his absence, she discovered something unexpected. She was afraid of him returning, almost as much as she was afraid of him staying away. On the 17th day, Barbara stopped waiting. She had explored every room in the penthouse. She had reorganized her major belongings 3 times. She had memorized the schedules of the housekeeper, the doorman, and the delivery drivers. She had become an expert in the architecture of the emptiness. Moses still had not spoken to her. He returned to the penthouse only after midnight, when he thought she was asleep. She would hear the soft click of the elevator, the whispers of the front door closing, the quiet padding of his footsteps towards the guest bedroom. Her heart thundering in her chest, waiting for him to change his mind, to demand what husbands demanded. He never did. The day he disappeared, she didn't know where. The penthouse staff wouldn't tell her. They moved around like ghosts, efficient and silent, following orders that didn't include acknowledging her existence. Barbara had begun to understand the nature of her cage. It wasn't the penthouse, it was irrelevance. On the 17th day, she woke up one morning to find something different. A book sat on the kitchen counter, not left casually, deliberately placed, spine facing her. Waiting. It was a collection of poetry from James Baldwin. The pages were torn, some pages underlined in precise handwriting from the notes. There was no explanation, no message. She picked it up and a piece of paper fell out. Another note, this one shorter. You looked bored yesterday. That was all. Barbara sat at the kitchen counter for an hour holding the book, trying to understand what this meant. Was it an apology? A peace offering? A test? She opened to a random page and found a page underlined in dark ink. I have learned that people will forget what you said. People will forget what you did. but people will never forget how you made them feel. Her throat tightened. She didn't know why. That evening she waited in the living room instead of hiding in her bedroom as usual. She heard him arrive, the elevator, the door, the pause. When he realized she was there, he emerged in an expensive charcoal suit. His tie already loosened. Exhaustion etched into the lines of his face. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. He noticed the book in her laps. Something flickered across his expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening, a crack in the stone. Without a word, he walked past her into the kitchen. She heard him pour a drink, the clink of ice, the sound of a man trying to maintain distance even as he broke it. Barbara opened the book and began to read. Hours passed. She wasn't aware of time moving. The apartment filled with the kind of silence that isn't empty. It's full of unspoken things. She could feel him in the other room, the weight of his presence like atmospheric pressure. At some point, she realized she was crying, not from sadness, from recognition. The words on the page were speaking to her in a language of her own life, had never used to. They were speaking about love and loss at the same time. When she finally looked up from the book, it was past midnight, and the penthouse was darker now, the city lights casting everything in shades of blue and silver. He was standing in the doorway to the kitchen watching her. Barbara's breath caught. In the dim light, she could see him clearly, really see him, perhaps for the first time, not as the enemy's son. Not as the cold man who had married her, but as a person, a man who read poetry and underlined passages about how people made each other feel. A man who had left her alone when he could have done anything else. He didn't approach her, he simply nodded slightly as if acknowledging something they both now understood. And then he turned and went to the guest room. The door closed softly. Barbara sat in the darkness, the book still on her lap, and felt something fundamental shifted inside of her. It wasn't love yet. It was something more dangerous. I think curiosity. The beginning of seeing him as a human has started. She woke up the next morning when he left, not waiting, truly awake, reading by the window. She had moved through all of the hues by dawn and had started on Maya Angelou's novels. When she heard him preparing to leave, she looked up. He was dressed for work again, but something was different. His pace was slower. He paused at the entrance to the living room. For a moment, Barbara thought he might speak. His mouth opened slightly as if words were forming. Then he seemed to think better of it. Instead, he gestured towards the bookshelf in the far corner. He was giving her permission to use his books. She nodded. He left without another gesture, but something in his shoulder seemed lighter as he walked toward the elevator. That afternoon, the housekeeper, a woman named Grace, who had never spoken more than 3 words to Barbara, appeared with a set of keys. "Mr. Moses asked me to give you this," Grace said, her voice surprisingly warm. "The library has a reading room on the 3rd floor. Most people don't know about it." Barbara took the keys, confused. "He goes there sometimes," Grace continued, and there was something almost knowing in her expression. "When he needs to think, though, you might like it too." Before Barbara could ask questions, Grace had already disappeared back to her work. The library was on the 3rd floor of the building, a private collection that belonged to the entire complex, but was rarely used. It was breathtaking, floor-to-ceiling shelves, leather arms chairs worn soft with age, tall windows overlooking the city, and everywhere there were books. But what made her catch her breath was what she found on the reading table. A handwritten list, several pages long in Moses' precise script. "Books I think you should read. Books that changed how I understand things. Books about people who survived impossible situations. Books about love that wasn't supposed to exist." The list was long. The handwriting was careful at the bottom in a slightly messier script, as if written in a moment of less control. "Maybe we don't have to be enemies. Maybe we can just be two people trying to figure out how to exist in the same space without destroying each other." Barbara sank into one of the leather chairs. the list trembling in her hands. For the first time since her wedding day, she felt something other than fear. She felt hope. She felt sure. 3 weeks into her marriage, Barbara realized she was no longer afraid of Moses. What replaced the fear was something far more complicated, which was awareness. She had begun to understand his rhythms, the way he moved through the penthouse, with controlled precision, as if occupying space itself required discipline. The way his shoulders tensed when he returned from work, carrying the weight of whatever empire he was building or defending. The way he always left the library door slightly open when she was inside, as if wanting to know she was near without intruding. The way he had started leaving books for her, not just left casually, deliberately placed where she would find them. A slim volume of Toni Morrison on the kitchen counter, a collection of essays of Baldwin James, and some novels from Chimamanda Adichie beside her bed with a single page marked by a leather book. No more notes, no more explanation, just books and silent understanding. Barbara had begun to respond in kindness. She left him books too, poetry that made her think of him, essay about forgiveness, a biography of a man who had rebuilt his life from ashes. She would place them in the guest bedroom where he slept, or on the kitchen counter where he would find them. It was a language neither of them spoke aloud, but both understood it perfectly. On a Thursday evening, Barbara stood in the kitchen preparing dinner. She had asked Grace, who had become an unexpected ally, for permission to use the chef's kitchen. Grace had smiled in a way that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment. "He loved your cooking smell," Grace said. Was making jollof rice and stewed chicken, recipe her mother had taught her years ago, before the world became about business empires and enemy families. She was making comfort. She was making home. When Moses arrived, the penthouse was filled with smell of spices and slow-cooked love. He stopped in the doorway, his suit jacket already removed, his ties loosened. For a moment, he simply stood there, breathing in, his eyes closed. When he opened them, they were different, softer, younger, like a man remembering something it lost a long time ago. He looked at Barbara. She was in the kitchen, her back to him, stirring a pot. She wore a simple green dress, the first time he'd seen her in anything but black or white, or the wedding dress that still haunted him. "You are cooking," he said. It was the first word he had spoken to her in 3 weeks. His voice was lower than she expected, rougher, like it hadn't been used much. Barbara turned surprised. She had learned not to expect his words. She had learned to speak in the language of books and gestures, and then put a good careful distance that they maintained between them. "I hope that's all right," she said carefully. I asked Grace. "It's perfect." He moved into the kitchen, closer than he had ever come to her in the penthouse. "It smells." He didn't finish his sentence. He didn't need to. It smelled like life, like possibility, like a woman trying to build something in the ruins of a first marriage. They ate at the dining table room that had sat empty since the wedding. There were candles. Barbara had lit them without thinking, and he had not objected. The food was warm. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was companionable. "My mother made this," Barbara said quietly, not meeting his eyes, "before everything became about the business." Moses took another bite. "Before my father made her your enemy." It was the first time either of them had acknowledged the past directly. The words hung in the air, like a challenge and a confession at once. "Yes," Barbara said. "Was she happy?" he asked before. Barbara considered this. "I think so. I was too young to really know. I just remember her humming while she cooked. I remember my father laughing at dinner. I remember thinking that was what love looked like." Moses sat down his fork. "And now?" "Now, I don't know what I remember or if any of it was real." He was quiet for a long moment. "The feud started over a business deal," he said finally. "My father claimed your father stole his idea. Your father said my father was trying to ruin him out of jealousy. I have never known which was the truth or which version is true. Barbara looked at him. Does it matter? I used to think it did. I used to think the truth was worth any cost. He picked up his fork again. I am not sure I believe that anymore. They finished dinner in silence, but it was a different silence. It was the silence of two people beginning to exist in the same world rather than parallel ones. She was clearing the plate after dinner when he appeared in the kitchen doorway. Let me, he said. Barbara stopped in dish in hands. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said. He took the dish from her hands. Their fingers brushed. That was the first time they had touched since the marriage. Barbara's breath caught at the simple contact, the warmth of his skin. He didn't pull away. They washed the dishes together and it was absolutely domestic, absolutely intimate also. His hands were large, capable, surprisingly gentle, with the delicate plates. He worked efficiently, methodically, the same way he did everything. When they finished, the kitchen was spotless. Thank you, he said, for dinner. Then he paused. For trying also. I am not sure what I am trying to do, Barbara admitted. Neither am I. He leaned against the counter, and for the first time she could see exhaustion in him. But I think maybe we are trying the same thing. Which is, he replied, to see if there is a version of this that isn't a cage. Barbara felt something crack open inside her chest. Is there? He looked at her for a long time in the kitchen light. She could see flecks of gold in his eyes. I don't know yet, he said quietly, but I want to find out. She left the master bedroom door open just slightly, just enough that if he wanted to, he could come in, just enough that she was saying something without words. She didn't sleep. She lay in the darkness and her heart were thundering, waiting to see if he would cross the threshold, waiting to see if he was ready. She heard him arrive after midnight, heard him pause outside the bedroom, heard him stand there for what felt like eternity. Then she heard his footsteps continuing towards the guest room. The door closed softly. Barbara should have felt rejected. Instead, she felt something else. Respect. She had chosen not to take what was offered to her. Not because he didn't want it, but because he wanted it to mean something. Because he wanted her to be certain. Because he was learning slowly what it meant to love someone without consuming them. In the darkness of the penthouse, surrounded by the glow of the city, Barbara smiled. For the first time since her wedding day, she smiled not from obligation or performance, but from genuine understanding. They were learning to get the language of restraint and respect and the slow, careful building of something that might actually be real. 4 weeks into the marriage, Barbara's father demanded to see her. The message came through Moses' assistants, delivered with the kind of formality that suggested it was both a request and a threat. Her father wanted proof that the marriage was real, that she was fulfilling her obligations, that the alliance between the families was more than paper. Moses didn't show her the message, Grace did, slipping it into her hands one morning with a look of apology. He is worried, Grace whispered. Your father, people are talking, saying the marriage hasn't been consummated, saying Mr. Moses married you just to humiliate your family. Barbara's stomach turned. Of course, people were talking. In the world of business and old money, a marriage without intimacy was a marriage without credibility. It was a statement. It was a weakness to be exploited. She found Moses in the library that evening reading one of the books she had left him, a novel about second chances and redemption. My father wants to see me, she said without preamble. Moses looked up from the page. Okay. He wants proof that we are, she couldn't say it, that the marriage is legitimate. Understanding flickered across his face. He closed the book slowly, carefully, as if handling something fragile. What do you want? He asked. The question was so direct, so unexpected that Barbara couldn't answer immediately. What she did want. She wanted to stop being a bargain chip. She wanted to stop being afraid. She wanted the thing that had been growing between them to mean something, not to be performed for her father's satisfactions. I don't know, she whispered. Moses stood. He was close to her now, closer than he had been since that night in the kitchen. She could see the gold flickers in his eyes. She could see the struggles in his jaw. I won't use you to prove anything to anyone, he said quietly. Not even to save both our families. But people, I don't care what people think. His voice was harder now, edged with something dangerous. I stopped caring about that the day I married you and realized I was marrying a woman, not a strategy. Baba felt tears pricked her eyes. Then what do? We tell him the truth, he answered. Her father arrived on a Saturday morning, impeccably dressed, his face a mark of control and fury. He embraced her stiffly, checking her for bruises, for signs of mistreatment, for evidence of consummation written on her skin. Moses greeted him with cold civility in the penthouse living room. They stood on opposite sides of the space like generals before a treaty negotiation. Barbara looks well, her father said, a statement that managed to sound like both compliment and threats. She is, Moses replied. She's been reading a lot, getting to know the city, building a life. A life? Her father's voice dripped with disdain. The purpose of this marriage wasn't for her to be the life, Moses. It was to unite our families, to create an heir, to prove that this alliance is real. Barbara felt Moses' eyes on her, but she kept her gaze fixed on her father. The alliance is real, Moses said. The marriage is real, but Barbara is not a breathing mare. And I am not interested in using her body to prove anything to anyone. Her father's face flushed with rage. You married my daughter to humiliate her. That's what this is about. You wanted to show that you could take what's mine and render it useless. Barbara was never yours to take, Moses said, and his voice was so cold now that it filled the room with ice. And she was never useless. She's brilliant and kind and brave. She's been trying to exist in a situation designed to break her. And she's done it with more grace than either of us deserves. Barbara's father stood abruptly. This is exactly what I expected from you, exactly. You have destroyed the good thing I had left. He turned to Barbara and she saw something in his face that she hadn't seen in years. Pain. Real, undisguised pain. I did this for you, he said quietly. I made this alliance so you would be secure, so no one could ever hurt you the way I have been hurt, and you have thrown it back in my face. Barbara stood, her legs felt unsteady, but her voice was clear. You did it for yourself, father. You wanted me to heal your wounds by marrying your enemy's son. You wanted me to prove that you won, she said. But I won't do it. Not like that. Not by becoming a tool in someone else's war. Barbara, and you are wrong about Moses. You are wrong about all of this. Her father stared at her as if she were a stranger. Perhaps she realized she was. Then she continued. Moses has been more honest with me than you were. He gave me space to become myself instead of demanding I become what you needed. He respected me when he had every reason not to. If you want a relationship with me, she continued, you have to accept that I am my own person. You have to accept that I choose to be here. And you have to accept that Moses is not your enemy anymore. And at least not to me. The silence in the penthouse was absolute. Her father looked between them. Really looked. For the first time, he saw the space between them. That wasn't empty. He saw the way Moses had moved slightly as if wanting to stop her. But he went back. He saw the way Barbara stood straighter than she had in years. He saw that his daughter had become someone he didn't recognize. I see, he said finally. He straightened his jacket. Well, I suppose I should be going. At the door, he paused. He didn't turn around. Your mother would have been proud, he said quietly, of the woman you have become. Even if I don't understand it. Then he was gone. Are you all right? Moses asked. I don't know, Barbara said. I feel like I just burned down my life. And I am not sure what's going to grow in its space. Moses moved then. He crossed the space between them and took her hands. His touch was warm and solid and real. I know what I want to grow, he said. Quietly, if you will let me in. Barbara looked up at him. In the afternoon light streaming through the windows, she could see every line of his face, the strength, the vulnerability, the man who had chosen her over and over again. What do you want? She asked. I want to stop pretending we are strangers living in the same space. I want to stop sleeping in the guest bedroom. I want to stop being afraid that if I touch you, I will ruin something precious. He lifted his hands and brushed her cheek. I want to love you, Barbara. Not strategy, but real love. And this changed everything. He kissed her then, and it was nothing like the performance she had feared, and she answered yes. It was tender and careful and full of respect for everything they had built. It was a conversation in a new language, a language of equals, of two people who had learned to see each other's humanity, and that they had chosen themselves. When they pulled apart, Barbara was smiling through her ears and tears. "We should probably tell people," she said quietly. "Let them talk," Moses replied, his forehead still touching hers. "For once, I don't care what they think." They didn't sleep together immediately. Instead, they lay in the master bedroom, fully clothed, just holding each other. In the darkness, Moses' arm was around her. It was intimate in a way that had nothing to do with bodies and everything to do with trust. Moses talked for hours about his mother, about his family, about everything, and Barbara listened and understood and held him through it. When dawn came, they were still awake, still talking, still learning the contours of each other's hearts. Outside, the city woke up to a new day. Inside the penthouse, two people who had been enemies by accident and lovers by choice finally began to imagine a future that belonged to both of them. 2 months into the marriage, Barbara began to understand the architecture of power. It wasn't in the penthouse, it wasn't in the business deals Moses negotiated, or the empire he was slowly dismantling and rebuilding. The real power she discovered was in how people responded when you stopped asking for permission to exist. She had started small, a painting in the master bedroom, a work by a young black artist she did discovered in a gallery in Harlem. Moses had come home to find it hung on the wall opposite the bed, a splash of color in their previously neutral space. He smiled and said nothing, which meant everything. She had painted the guest room, the one he no longer slept in, a soft blue color. Grace had brought her flowers and Barbara had arranged them with the kind of care that suggested she was planning to stay. That wasn't temporary. That was her building something. The penthouse was slowly becoming a home, and it was a difficult kind of power that changed everything. Moses had been meeting with her father's lawyer for weeks. Barbara didn't know the details at first. She only noticed the tension in his shoulders when he returned from those meetings. One evening, he found her in the library, curled in one of the leather chairs, with a book on business ethics she just started reading of recent. He told her everything about her father's merge, wanting to merge the business. He's ready to end the feud and was willing also to do it on his terms. She replied him by saying, "Don't merge the companies to make him happy. Merge them or don't merge them based on what you think is right, based on what you want, not for him, not for me, not for anyone else, but for yourself." The merger was announced in the financial pages, but what the papers didn't understand was the shift that had occurred. It wasn't just a business decision, it was a statement. It was Moses saying that the old ways, the ways of vendetta and possession, and using people as currencies were over. Her father had called after the announcement. "He's giving you a seat on the board," her father said, and she could hear the confusion in his voice. "An actual seat with voting power." "Yes," Barbara said. "How is that possible? You don't have experience." "I am learning education. I am reading competence. I am going to prove it." Barbara had never been more certain of anything. "And even if I were completely incomplete, Father, I did still deserve to be there because I am part of this family now, because I have a stake in its future, because I matter." There was a long silence, but her father replied that her mother would be so proud. Over the next 3 months, Barbara transformed more than just the penthouse. She started attending business meetings and reading every report she could get her hands on. She surprised Moses by understanding the mergers better than he expected. She surprised herself by having opinions, strong ones, about how the combined company should move forward. She began having lunch with other women in business world, learning the written and unwritten rules that were hidden and open. She discovered that there were other women like her, intelligent and capable, waiting for someone to finally see them. She began to mentor one of them, a young woman named Zara, who reminded her of herself 6 months ago. Moses watched all of this with something that looked like awe. He would come home to find Barbara at the penthouse desk, laptop, open reading financial statements. He would listen to her as she discussed market projects with Grace, of all people, who turned out to have a keen understanding of business. He would attend board meetings and watch his wife, his actual real wife, command a room with intelligence and grace. And he fell in love with her all over again. Not the woman he had married out of obligation, not the woman he had slowly come to respect, but this woman, this brilliant, first, fully realized version of Barbara, who had been waiting inside her all along for someone to finally believe that she was worth seeing. One evening, 4 months into the marriage, Moses surprised her. He brought her to the rooftop of their penthouse building, and it was transformed. Candles lined the edge. A table was set for two. The city spread out below them like a kingdom. "What is this?" Barbara asked, though she was already smiling. "A celebration," Moses said, taking her hands. "For you, for becoming the woman you were always meant to be." They sat under the stars and Barbara looked out the city that had seemed like a prison 4 months ago, and now it felt like possibility. "I have something for you," Moses said, and produced a small box. Barbara's heart ceased. She had thought they were past grand gestures, that their love didn't need the trappings of romance. But when she opened the box, she understood. It wasn't a diamond, it was a key. "What is this?" she asked. "Property," Moses said, "a building downtown. It's been renovated into a business incubator for women entrepreneurs. I want you to run it. Not because I am your husband, because you are brilliant and you have a vision for helping women who have been invisible the way you were. I want you to have something that completely complements you and that is yours." Barbara felt tears spill down her cheeks. "Moses, you taught me something," he continued quietly. "You taught me that real love isn't about keeping someone. It's about setting them free to become everything they are capable of being. So I am setting you free, Barbara, to be a woman of your own kingdom. I don't want to be separate from you," Barbara said, her voice shaking. "You are not," he replied, taking her hands. "I am not trying to separate us. I am trying to expand us. And I want to be a man who loves a woman who is powerful in her own right. I want to build something with you." And they hugged each other. The next morning, Barbara found a letter from her father on the penthouse counter. Reading it, it was words of encouragement for the vision and the future for her and her business that she's about to start. 3 months later, the business incubator opened and Barbara stood in the lobby, all glass and lights, and the kind of architecture that suggested possibility, and looked at the plaque with her name on it, Executive Director Barbara Moses. She hadn't taken his surname in the traditional sense. Instead, she had made it in her own way and merged it with her own identity until they were inseparable but not consuming. She saw Zara in the crowd of women, and she saw her own younger version, her own young self, the hunger to be seen, to be valued, and to be heard. Moses stood at the back door of the room watching her as she welcomed the cohorts, and in his eyes, everything said that he was so proud of her. That evening at home in the penthouse that had become their kingdom, Barbara stood at the window where she had. Some months later, after successful business transformation, Barbara discovered she was pregnant. Now she is 7 months pregnant. She discovered her pregnancy by accident when she thought she was sick and went to the hospital for exhaustion. Instead, she had found out that the kingdom she and Moses had been building would have a new inhabitant. When she told him, he had simply held her and cried, and she understood that his tears were for all the version of fatherhood he had been afraid he could never get to experience. Now, as she stood in their penthouse, her hands on her swollen belly, Barbara thought about the kind of world she wanted her child to inherit. She had continued her business despite her pregnancy, and everything was going smoothly. One evening, she received a call from her father saying he was so proud of her and he was so grateful that the family problem and threat have come to an end. 3 months later, Barbara went into labor on a rainy Thursday night. Moses drove her to the hospital, and she held his hands the entire way. He told her stories to distract her from the pain. He told her about his mother, about the woman she reminded him of, not in appearance but in spirit. He told her about the day he first realized he was falling in love with her, which turned out to be the day she cooked jollof rice, and he had finally remembered what home felt like. The labor was long and hard, and Barbara screamed and pushed, and Moses never let go of her hand. When the baby came a daughter, with her mother's eyes and her father's serious expression, the entire room seemed to exhale. The nurses cleaned her and wrapped her in a blanket, and then they placed her in Moses' arms. He looked down at his daughter, this new human who represented everything he and Barbara had built together, and wept. "She's perfect," he whispered. Barbara, exhausted and triumphant, and fundamentally changed by what her body had just accomplished, smiled. "What do we call her?" Moses asked. Barbara had thought about this for months. She had wanted a name that meant something, a name that carried history and hope, and the kind of defiance it took to become yourself. "Grace," she said, "after the woman who helped me see that I belonged in this world." Moses nodded, understanding completely. He brought the baby to Barbara, and she held her daughter for the first time. And in that moment, she understood something fundamental. The kingdom she had been building wasn't made of glass and steel and city, and also views. It was made of love, real and choosing love that showed up every single day and refused to be anything less than honest. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, drop your comments, help us in sharing. God bless you.